HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Black Noir, Mystery, Crime, and Suspense Fiction by African-American Writers. By Otto Penzler. Read by Sean Crisden and Joniece Abbott-Pratt. Introduction. Otto Penzler. Mystery fiction, written by black authors, is, not surprisingly, often very different from work in that broadly defined genre written by white writers. The early novels, and short stories in particular, tended to show the detective in a reasonably insular community trying to solve crimes with black victims and committed, in all likelihood, by black villains. There was little reliance on the outside, mainly white world to administer justice. A nation's government, in order for detective stories to flourish, needs to be a relatively democratic one. Under dictatorial and repressive regimes, it is the police themselves who are regarded by much of the citizenry as villainous, not as the source of relief from fear and injustice. The police, or their closely allied counterparts, militia, are in the employ of governments that use them to suppress the freedom of the men and women under their control. To speak out against emperors, czars, dictators, or monarchs means a swift trip to prison or the gallows. And it is the police who arrest the dissidents and bring them to their fate. As the enemy, then, it is hardly likely that fiction would be created in which these figures would serve as the righteous heroes who would protect society from murderers, robbers, and other criminals. For mystery fiction to attain any degree of popularity, the culture in which it could be created requires the same elements upon which all forms of literary entertainment depend. A country has to be fairly prosperous, allowing a significant portion of the population to have leisure time. Edgar Allan Poe's invention of the first genuine detective story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, in 1841, approximately coincided with the start of the Industrial Revolution, beginning the process of changing America from a largely agrarian society to a manufacturing one. Gone for many thousands of people were the endless hours required to run a subsistence-level farm, replaced by increased income and the commensurate free time that allowed for the pursuit of relaxation and entertainment. As schools and literacy increased, so did the number of books and magazines that fed a newly created demand. England, a mighty colonial power, had been increasing the national wealth for many years, much of it trickling down to its populace. After France recovered from the excesses of its revolution, the French, too, enjoyed relative political freedom and a robust economy. Sadly, little of this newly found social and political freedom affected the majority of Africans. On the continent of their homeland, there was virtually no tradition of the written word. As millions of Africans were uprooted to become slaves in America, the Caribbean, and many other parts of the world, there was little opportunity to learn to read or write. The very concept of creating literature was absurd in the context of the lives they lived. Even after British and American slaves were freed, their lack of educational opportunities, in confluence with an absence of a literary history, were not conducive to an establishment of any meaningful body of work. As the 20th century approached, society, slowly and reluctantly, began to shift in small ways as modest numbers of blacks entered such mainstream elements of the culture as academia, law, medicine, science, and the arts. Fiction by black writers, often, but not exclusively, produced for magazines run by and for blacks, became more abundant. It tended to portray life in black communities that were theoretically part of America but in fact were separated from white America. Stories were frequently set in the black ghettos or the black middle-class section of the city, often in dialect that was clearly designed to appeal to core black readers. While many of these stories featured blacks as the victims of institutionalized racism, a large number of stories and novels by black writers of the time were highly sentimental romances, just as were those written by white writers. Fiction is a mirror of society. While individual works may be filtered through the prejudices and limitations of their authors, the entire oeuvre of a given period of time, compared or contrasted with a different time, will accurately illustrate changes of attitude and practice. The black American experience following World War I reflected a greater level of integration into the rest of society, particularly in the North. The economic growth of the first 3 decades of the 20th century affected Americans of all socioeconomic levels. The rich got richer, while the poor got less poor. Mandatory schooling improved literacy rates, so more people, black and white, were able to read and write. So they did. Fiction magazines flooded newsstands, millions being sold every month, and while no type of fiction was ignored, none was more eagerly consumed than detective stories, notably in the pulps, most of which were written by white writers about white characters and read by white readers. There were exceptions, of course. W. Adolph Roberts, a black Caribbean author, wrote 3 mystery novels, beginning with The Haunting Hand in 1926, and some adventure fiction that bumped against the edges of the genre. Rudolph Fisher wrote an important Harlem Renaissance detective novel, The Conjure Man Dies, in 1932, and one of the most significant figures in the development of the black crime and mystery story, Chester Himes, wrote his first story in 1933, beginning a career that would span more than 4 decades. The years following World War II marked the continuation of the absorption of black Americans into a more integrated society, a process dramatically accelerated during the Civil Rights Movement that began in earnest during the 1960s. While many novels and short stories by black Americans had been published during the 20th century, very few were detective novels. Many blacks saw the police as adversaries, whose job it was to maintain the social status quo by beating them into submission. Therefore, just as non-democratic societies failed to produce detective fiction, so did the black community. Though a high percentage of the fiction created by these authors contained elements of crime fiction, alcoholism, drug addiction, and violence, with black characters both as the perpetrators and as the victims, were frequently found in the works of Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Clarence Cooper Jr., and others. But it has not been until the past 20 years or so that there has been a regular flow of detective stories by black writers. Although not the first, certainly the opener of the way was Walter Mosley. The debut of Easy Rawlins in Devil in a Blue Dress, 1990, marked the beginning of the crossover era in which white readers didn't need to feel virtuously liberal for reading a black mystery writer. They could read it for the pure pleasure of reading an excellent novel about fascinating, original characters, bringing to the experience the same incentive they had had for years when reading books by white writers with white characters: entertainment. The books in the Rawlins series have gone on to enjoy tremendous success, both critically and with frequent appearances on the bestseller list. Mosley has indicated his intention to abandon the character, but his other work has also found a large readership, especially his mystery and crime fiction. After Mosley, readers discovered the work of such black writers as Barbara Neely, Hugh Holton, Gar Anthony Haywood, whose first novels actually preceded those by Mosley, Paula L. Woods, Robert Greer, Cary Phillips, Eleanor Taylor Bland, and the British writer Mike Phillips, among others. Many of the books and stories by contemporary black writers continue to examine the black experience in a society in which it remains a minority, focusing on the ways in which it is different and separate from its fellow citizens. In this collection, for instance, Rudolph Fisher's John Archer's Nose and Robert Greer's Oprah's Song could never be made into a film with white actors. Others have little or no relation to race. The thieves in Cary Phillips' story House of Tears could just as easily be white and the story would be unchanged. The police in Paula L. Woods' story I'll Be Doggone could be Latin or Indian, black or white, and it wouldn't make a bit of difference. There's much to be said for a tale that emphasizes and highlights the colorful differences between one group and another. There's an equally valid point to telling a story in which differences between people vanish, or at least have little significance. Ultimately, what should matter is whether the story is a good one. In this book, you will hear stories that transcend race and genre to fulfill their primary purpose: to inform and entertain. Edward Paul Jones, 1951, was raised in Washington, D.C. and educated at Holy Cross in Massachusetts, and then received an MFA from the University of Virginia. After teaching creative writing, he took a job as a proofreader and rewriter at Tax Notes, a publication devoted to changes in tax laws. It was during this time that he began writing short fiction, which was eventually collected in his first book, Lost in the City, which was shortlisted for the National Book Award and won the Penn-Hemingway Award but failed to sell more than 5,000 copies. He then spent 12 years researching and writing The Known World, 2003, a novel set in pre-Civil War Virginia that focused on the free blacks who owned slaves. It was also nominated for a National Book Award and won both the Pulitzer Prize and the 2005 International Impact Dublin Literary Award. The following year, he was given a MacArthur Fellowship. In 2006, Jones published his third book, All Aunt Hagar's Children, another short story collection about African-American working-class people in Washington. Jones prefers a simple life, living conservatively as he remembers when he couldn't find a job after graduating college. He was on his way to live with his sister in Brooklyn, New York, when he learned that his first story had been bought by Essence magazine. Old Boys, Old Girls was first published in the May 3, 2004 issue of The New Yorker. It was chosen for both Best American Short Stories and Best American Mystery Stories, 2005. Old Boys, Old Girls. Edward P. Jones. They caught him after he had killed the second man. The law would never connect him to the first murder, so the victim, a stocky fellow, Caesar Matthews, shot in a northeast alley only 2 blocks from the home of the guy's parents, a man who died over a woman who was actually in love with a third man, was destined to lie in his grave without anyone officially paying for what had happened to him. It was almost as if, at least on the books the law kept, Caesar had got away with a free killing. 7 months after he stabbed the second man, a 22-year-old with prematurely gray hair who had ventured out of Southeast for only the 6th time in his life, Caesar was tried for murder in the 2nd degree. During much of the trial, he remembered the name only of the first dead man, Percy, or Golden Boy Weymouth, and not the second, Antoine Stoddard, to whom everyone kept referring during the proceedings. The world had done things to Caesar since he'd left his father's house for good at 16, nearly 14 years ago. But he had done far more to himself. So, at trial, with the weight of all the harm done to him and because he had hidden for months in one shithole after another, he was not always himself, and thought many times that he was actually there for killing Golden Boy, the first dead man. He was not insane, but he was 3 doors from it, which was how an old girlfriend, Yvonne Miller, would now and again playfully refer to his behavior. Who the fuck is this Antoine bitch? Caesar sometimes thought during the trial. And where is Percy? It was only when the judge sentenced him to 7 years in Lorton, D.C.'s prison in Virginia, that matters became somewhat clear again. And in those last moments before they took him away, he saw Antoine spread out on the ground outside the Prime Property nightclub, blood spurting out of his chest like oil from a bountiful well. Caesar remembered it all, sitting on the sidewalk, the liquor spinning his brain, his friends begging him to run, the club's music flooding out of the open door and going thumpity-thump-thump against his head. He sat a few feet from Antoine and would have killed again for a cigarette.
"That's you, baby, so very near insanity it can touch you,"
said Yvonne, who believed in unhappiness and who thought happiness was the greatest trick God had invented. Yvonne Miller would be waiting for Caesar at the end of the line. He came to Lorton with a ready-made reputation, since Moultrie Wilson and Tony Cathedral, first-degree murderers both and destined to die there, knew him from his Northwest and Northeast days. They were about as big as you could get in Lorton at that time. The guards called Lorton the House of Moultrie and Cathedral, and they let everyone know that Caesar was good people, a protected body, with no danger of having his biscuits or his butt taken. A little less than a week after Caesar arrived, Cathedral asked him how he liked his cellmate. Caesar had never been to prison, but had spent 5 days in the D.C. jail, not counting the time there before and during the trial. They were side by side at dinner, and neither man looked at the other. Moultrie sat across from them. Cathedral was done eating in 3 minutes, but Caesar always took a long time to eat. His mother had raised him to chew his food thoroughly. "You want to be a old man living on oatmeal?" "I love oatmeal, Mama." "Tell me that when you have to eat it every day till you die." "He all right, I guess," Caesar said of his cellmate, with whom he had shared fewer than 1,000 words. Caesar's mother had died before she saw what her son became. "You got the bunk you want? The right bed?" Moultrie said. He was sitting beside one of his two women, the one he had turned out most recently. She was picking at her food, something Moultrie had already warned her about. The woman had a family, a wife and 3 children, but they would not visit. Caesar would never have visitors either. "It's all right." Caesar had taken the top bunk, as the cellmate had already made the bottom his home. A miniature plastic panda from his youngest child dangled on a string, hung from one of the metal bedposts. "Bottom, top, it's all the same shit." Cathedral leaned into him, picking chicken out of his teeth with an inch-long fingernail sharpened to a point. "Listen, man, even if you like the top bunk, you fuck him up for the bottom just 'cause you gotta let him know who rules. You let him know that you will stab him through his motherfucking heart and then turn around and eat your supper, including the dessert." Cathedral straightened up. "Sees, you gonna be here a few days, so you can't let nobody fuck with your humanity." He went back to the cell and told Pancho Morrison that he wanted the bottom bunk. Couldn't sleep well at the top. "Too bad," Pancho said. He was lying down, reading a book published by the Jehovah's Witnesses. He wasn't a witness, but he was curious. Caesar grabbed the book and flung it at the bars, and the bulk of it slid through an inch or so and dropped to the floor. He kicked Pancho in the side, and before he could pull his leg back for a second kick, Pancho took the foot in both hands, twisted it, and threw him against the wall. Then Pancho was up, and they fought for nearly an hour before 2 guards, who had been watching the whole time, came in and beat them about the head. "Show's over, show's over," one kept saying. They attended to themselves in silence in the cell, and with the same silence they flung themselves at each other the next day, after dinner. They were virtually the same size, and though Caesar came to battle with more muscle, Pancho had more heart. Cathedral had told Caesar that morning that Pancho had lived on practically nothing but heroin for the 3 years before Lorton, so whatever fighting dog was in him could be pounded out in little or no time. It took 3 days. Pancho was the father of 5 children, and each time he swung he did so with the memory of all 5, and what he had done to them over those 3 addicted years. He wanted to return to them and try to make amends, and he realized on the morning of the 3rd day that he would not be able to do that if Caesar killed him. So, 14 minutes into the fight, he sank to the floor after Caesar hammered him in the gut. And though he could have got up, he stayed there, silent and still. The 2 guards laughed. The daughter who had given Pancho the panda was 9 years old and had been raised by her mother as a Catholic. That night, before the place went dark, Caesar lay on the bottom bunk and looked over at pictures of Pancho's children, which Pancho had taped on the opposite wall. He knew he would have to decide if he wanted Pancho just to move the photographs or to put them away altogether. All the children had toothy smiles. The 2 youngest stood in separate pictures, outdoors in their first communion clothes. Caesar himself had been a father for 2 years. A girl he had met at an F Street club in Northwest had told him he was the father of her son, and for a time he had believed her. Then the boy started growing big ears that Caesar thought didn't belong to anyone in his family. And so, after he had slapped the girl a few times a week before the child's 2nd birthday, she confessed that the child belonged to my first love. "Your first love is always with you," she said, sounding forever like a television addict who had never read a book. As Caesar prepared to leave, she asked him, "You want back all the toys and things you gave him?" The child, as if used to their fighting, had slept through this last encounter on the couch, part of a living room suite that they were paying for on time. Caesar said nothing more and didn't think about his 18-karat gold cigarette lighter until he was 8 blocks away. The girl pawned the thing and got enough to pay off the furniture bill. Caesar and Pancho worked in the laundry, and Caesar could look across the noisy room with all the lint swirling about and see Pancho sorting dirty pieces into bins. Then he would push uniform bins to the left and everything else to the right. Pancho had been doing that for 3 years. The job he got after he left Lorton was as a gopher at construction sites. No laundry in the outside world wanted him. Over the next 2 weeks, as Caesar watched Pancho at his job, his back always to him, he considered what he should do next. He wasn't into fucking men, so that was out. He still had not decided what he wanted done about the photographs on the cell wall. One day at the end of those 2 weeks, Caesar saw the light above Pancho's head flickering, and Pancho raised his head and looked for a long time at it, as if thinking that the answer to all his problems lay in fixing that one light. Caesar decided then to let the pictures remain on the wall. 3 years later, they let Pancho go. The two men had mostly stayed at a distance from each other, but toward the end they had been talking, sharing plans about a life beyond Lorton. The relationship had reached the point where Caesar was saddened to see the children's photographs come off the wall. Pancho pulled off the last taped picture, and the wall was suddenly empty in a most forlorn way. Caesar knew the names of all the children. Pancho gave him a rabbit's foot that one of his children had given him. It was the way among all those men that when a good luck piece had run out of juice, it was given away with the hope that new ownership would renew its strength. The rabbit's foot had lost its electricity months before Pancho's release. Caesar's only good fortune piece was a keychain made in Peru. It had been sweet for a bank robber in the next cell for nearly 2 years until the man's daughter, walking home from 3rd grade, was abducted and killed. One day, after Pancho left, they brought in a thief and 3-time rapist of elderly women. He nodded to Caesar and told him that he was Watson Rainey and went about making a home for himself in the cell, finally plugging in a tiny lamp with a green shade which he placed on the metal shelf jutting from the wall. Then he climbed onto the top bunk he had made up and lay down. His name was all the wordplay he had given Caesar, who had been smoking on the bottom bunk throughout Rainey's efforts to make a nest. Caesar waited 10 minutes, and then stood and pulled the lamp's cord out of the wall socket, and grabbed Rainey with one hand and threw him to the floor. He crushed the lamp into Rainey's face. He choked him with the cord.
"You come into my house and show me no respect!"
Caesar shouted. The only sound Rainey could manage was a gurgling that bubbled up from his mangled mouth. There were no witnesses, except for an old man across the way, who would occasionally glance over at the two when he wasn't reading his Bible. It was over and done with in 4 minutes. When Rainey came to, he found everything he owned piled in the corner, soggy with piss. And Caesar was again on the top bunk. They would live in that cell together until Caesar was released 4 years later. Rainey tried never to be in the house during waking hours. If he was there when Caesar came in, he would leave. Rainey's name, spoken by him that first day, were all the words that would ever pass between the two men. A week or so after Rainey got there, Caesar bought from Moultrie a calendar that was 3 years old. It was large and had no markings of any sort, as pristine as the day it was made. "You know this one ain't the year we in right now," Moultrie said as one of his women took a quarter from Caesar and dropped it in her purse. Caesar said, "It'll do." Moultrie prized the calendar for one thing. Its top half had a photograph of a naked woman of indeterminate race sitting on a stool, her legs wide open, her pussy aimed dead at whoever was standing right in front of her. It had been Moultrie's good luck piece, but the luck was dead. Moultrie remembered what the calendar had done for him, and he told his woman to give Caesar his money back, lest any new good fortune piece turn sour on him. The calendar's bottom half had the days of the year. That day, the first Monday in June, Caesar drew in the box that was January 1st a line that went from the upper left-hand corner down to the bottom right-hand corner. The next day, a June Tuesday, he made a line in the January 2nd box that also ran in the same direction. And so it went. When the calendar had all such lines in all the boxes, it was the next June. Then Caesar, in that January 1st box, made a line that formed an X with the first line. And so it was for another year. The 3rd year saw horizontal marks that sliced the boxes in half. The 4th year had vertical lines down the centers of the boxes. This was the only calendar Caesar had in Lorton. That very first Monday, he taped the calendar over the area where the pictures of Pancho's children had been. There was still a good deal of empty space left, but he didn't do anything about it, and Rainey knew he couldn't do anything either. The calendar did right by Caesar until near the end of his 5th year in Lorton, when he began to feel that its juice was drying up. But he kept it there to mark off the days, and, too, the naked woman never closed her legs to him. In that 5th year, someone murdered Moultrie as he showered. The killers, it had to be more than one for a man like Moultrie, were never found. The Moultrie woman who picked at her food had felt herself caring for a recent arrival who was 5 years younger than her. a part-time deacon who had killed a Southwest bartender for calling the deacon's wife a woman without one fucking brain cell. The story of that killing, the bartender was dropped headfirst from the roof of a 10-story building, became legend, and in Lorton, men referred to the dead bartender as the Flathead Insulter, and the killer became known as the Righteous Desulter. The Desulter, wanting Moultrie's lady, had hired people to butcher him. It had always been the duty of the lady who hated food to watch out for Moultrie as he showered, but she had stepped away that day, just as she had been instructed to by the Desulter. In another time, Cathedral and Caesar would have had enough of everything, from muscle to influence, to demand that someone give up the killers. But the prison was filling up with younger men who did not care what those two had been once upon a time. Also, Cathedral had already had 2 visits from the man he had killed in Northwest. Each time, the man had first stood before the bars of Cathedral's cell. Then he held one of the bars and opened the door inward, like some wooden door on a person's house. The dead man standing there would have been sufficient to unwrap anyone, but matters were compounded when Cathedral saw a door that for years had slid sideways, now opened in an impossible fashion. The man stood silent before Cathedral, and when he left he shut the door gently, as if there were sleeping children in the cell. So Cathedral didn't have a full mind, and Moultrie was never avenged. There was an armed robbery man in the place, a tattooer with homemade inks and needles. He made a good living painting on both muscled and frail bodies the names of children. The devil in full regalia, with a pitchfork dripping with blood. The words Mother or Mother Forever, surrounded by red roses and angels who looked sad, because when it came to drawing happy angels, the tattoo man had no skills. One pickpocket had had a picture of his father tattooed in the middle of his chest. Above the father's head, in medieval lettering, were the words, Rotting in Hell, with the letter H done in fiery yellow and red. The tattoo guy had told Caesar that he had skin worthy of a painter's best canvas, that he could give Caesar a tattoo God would envy. Caesar had always told him no, but then he awoke one snowy night in March of his 6th year and realized that it was his mother's birthday. He did not know what day of the week it was, but the voice that talked to him had the authority of 1,000,000 loving mothers. He had long ago forgotten his own birthday, had not even bothered to ask someone in prison records to look it up. There had never been anyone or anything he wanted commemorated on his body. Maybe it would have been Carol, his first girlfriend 20 years ago, before the retarded girl entered their lives. He had played with the notion of having the name of the boy he thought was his put over his heart, but the lie had come to light before that could happen. And before the boy, there had been Yvonne, with whom he had lived for an extraordinary time in Northeast. He would have put Yvonne's name over his heart, but she went off to work one day and never came back. He looked for her for 3 months, and then just assumed that she had been killed somewhere and dumped in a place only animals knew about. Yvonne was indeed dead, and she would be waiting for him at the end of the line, though she did not know that was what she was doing.
You can always trust unhappiness,
Yvonne had once said, sitting in the dark on the couch, her cigarette burned down to the filter.
His face never changes, but happiness is slick, can't be trusted. It has 1,000 faces, sees, all of them just ready to reform into unhappiness once it has you in its clutches.
So Caesar had the words Mother Forever tattooed on his left bicep. Knowing that more letters meant a higher payment of cigarettes or money or candy, the tattoo fellow had dissuaded him from having just plain Mother.
How many hours you think she spent in labor?
He asked Caesar.
Just to give you life.
The job took 5 hours over 2 days during a snowstorm. Caesar said no to angels, knowing the man's ability with happy ones, and had the words done in blue letters encased in red roses. The man worked from the words printed on a piece of paper that Caesar had given him, because he was also a bad speller. The snow stopped on the 3rd day, and strangely it took only another 3 days for the 2 feet of mess to melt, for with the end of the storm came a heat wave. The tattoo man, a good friend of the righteous Desulter, would tell Caesar in late April that what happened to him was his own fault, that he had not taken care of himself, as he had been instructed to do.
And the heat ain't helped you neither.
on the night of March 31st, 5 days after the tattoo had been put on. Caesar woke in the night with a pounding in his left arm. He couldn't return to sleep, so he sat on the edge of his bunk until...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?